So today we're going to take a little bit of time and just run through a little bit about kits, and more specifically with kits, the kind of the area of some specific formula operators that you can use within them. But before we get into those, just kind of a couple of general statements about as you're building formulas and kits, and really all this is kind of surrounds that area of it is how do you make a the component items of kits do what you want them to do per se. So a couple of quick tips just to keep in mind as a general statement. And also, just by the way, sorry for all the preliminary statements here, but at the end of the webinar in the chat window, I'm gonna chat you a couple of links to a couple of previous webinars that we did. They were kind of a part one and part two that we did in the spring. One was a bit more toward just generically putting kits together, and then the second one kind of went into some more details in specific areas. So I'll chat those in this at the end of this session, where you can grab those links, and if you're interested in, if you hadn't seen those before, you can avail yourselves of those resources. But so this specifically, a couple of lead-in things. One is that if you're, when it comes to calculating your inputs, so here you can see on my screen, here's an example. I've got my roof decking kit here, and I'm calculating a few different things that are down below here. The first thing to keep in mind is that when you're calculating for the child of a kit item, is to remember that you're calculating for the input field that's here. So you're not really calculating something for the output, and that can be there can be a tendency to tend to do that, in where you're saying, well, I'm just going to calculate what I want to be on the material list, which is not really the way that kits think. Or the way that kits are intended to work and think is it's really calculating what value to put here into the input field. Now, in the case of a count operation or a count type of application here, like a miscellaneous connector, is kind of the same difference, right? You're saying, well, I need 6 here, and there's no waste involved, so it's 6 here. So it's a little bit of the same thing. But when you get into something else, like say, how many shingles to use. In this case, what I need to calculate for is how much square footage should I put into the input field. So I don't want to try to calculate how many bundles to send. I'm going to let the formula, the standard formula, do all that stuff for me. Instead, I just need to figure out what is the right value into the input field. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, and that will matter even more as we talk about our last item here today. Second thing is, just as a sort of a quick coaching thing, just sort of a nuance about how Prebuild does some of these calculations and operators when you're building these formulas, is if you're going to be doing in your operators here, if you're going to be dividing by something, I didn't even necessarily do it here, but just a general rule of thumb is use a decimal value. So adding a decimal value behind it. There's going to be some cases where it doesn't matter, like the one I just showed you, but there's going to be other cases where, just because of the way the formulas and the equations work, having that decimal value in there actually kind of gets it where it needs to be. So just as a general rule, it shouldn't change anything for you about it as far as your experience, but just adding in those decimal values when you're going to be doing division type work, that's always a good practice to follow, to just kind of keep you in the middle of the road more. So those are the two kind of quick lead-in statements. Now, what I really wanted to focus on here today, is in our short time, was these operators within the equations. And I'm going to jump over here to the profile tab, come to my kits, and I'm just going to pull up a new kit component here just for a minute, just so I can get to this section right here where this FX button is, where you'll be building the equation. And if you click on these FX, this will show you the list of available functions that you can use within your equation builder as you're building stuff out. If I click on this, you can see, wow, there's a whole list of them here that you might be able to use. And that can be a little overwhelming, especially if you're not as familiar with building Excel type of formulas. Now, these are not necessarily the same, interchangeable with Excel here, but the concepts are the same in many cases. So that looks maybe a little overwhelming, but let's just break it down to just 3 simple ones. This is really, as we interface with customers and things that we've been asked about over in the past as people build out their kit formulas, aside from the standard operators of multiplication and division and add and subtract, of course those are all available that you can put into your formulas, there really are 3 functions that pretty much covers nearly everything that you would need or want to do, at least in most cases. And those three formulas, so starting, I'm just going to work through those three. The first one is going to be the ceiling function, which you'll see right here. The decimal ceiling function is right here. And the idea behind that function really is the idea of rounding things up. So it always takes things up. So it's different from a round function in the sense that it doesn't just like find, round down or round up depending on where it is. Instead, it actually is just always taking things up a level. Now, that can be important. I'm going to come over here to my roof decking kit. That can be especially important when you're trying to calculate something that actually has like a package value. So here's a great example of that would be like roof clips. So I've got a roof clip line item right here for my roof decking. I actually have two, but we'll talk about that in a moment. I've got a roof decking line item here, and you can see here it's the R50 version, meaning it's a package of 50 of those clips. And so you can see in my equation that I built here that I am using the ceiling function. So I'm going to come over here on the right-hand side. You see I'm taking the square footage, I'm seeing how many sheets there are, I'm multiplying that times 4, and then I get to that total value and I'm dividing by 50 because this is a package of 50. Now, all of that, though, is put inside of this ceiling type function, and the intent there is to round up. Because if I was to calculate, how many, divide by 50 to figure out how many packages of 50, and I came up with basically in the background, it's, 1 1/4 packages, I wouldn't want the software to say, oh, 1 1/4, that's closer to 1, so I'll just round down. That obviously, in most cases, that's not going to work out well because you're going to end up being short with the stuff that's in the field. So in this case, when you're having package type things where it's like, well, I just need to basically go up to the next level, to the next item up, that's where you would use the ceiling function. That way you're always getting more, not potentially less than what you should be sending to the job site. So that's operator number 1 would be the ceiling function. So look for ways that as you build out your equations in the cases where you need to round up, which is in the estimating world is nearly always. Second function that you guys can leverage as you build your equation that's really handy is the if statement. Now, I'm going to come over here. I'm just going to open up one of these, and you can see I'm actually using one right here. I'm going to open up this editor, and I'm going to come here to the function list. So you come here to find these list of functions. There actually are a few different ones in here that are using the if statement. There's the integer version, if statement, and then there's also a decimal one. Pretty much for most everybody, the one that you really just want to use is the string statement. They all kind of work similarly, except for the fact of what they're expecting to receive as a result in them. So usually what I recommend using is using the SIF statement, the string if statement, where it's the basic concept here is the Boolean or basically true false type of operation that's being found is, basically check to see if something is true or false. And if it's true, then we'll do the thing that's shown first here and after the first comma. And if it's false, then we'll do the thing that's over here. So you can see here, let's see, which one do I have open here? So here, I'm going to come back to my, just a simple one here. This one, I have this for a miscellaneous connector. And you can see here that I've got an if statement. And so what this if statement is checking for is saying, okay, if the square footage, I'm referencing the SF of the parent, if the SF, the square foot of the parent, is less than 400, then we're going to do this first thing, where we're going to basically calculate the number of clips. And the second one, it's going to do, in this case, it's going to do nothing. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So this is a great operator when you basically want to be able to vary the behavior. If whatever your true and false thing that you're checking for, if it's square foot under a value, or if it's, maybe it's square footage minus 100 and then check the value, or maybe it's the lineal footage of the parent or the output count, whatever it is that you're checking, you could check to see if something is true. And then based on that behavior, you could have one set of behavior for if it's true, and then have a different set of behavior for if it's false. So it's a great way to, instead of it you just being limited to a particular type of behavior, there's just one behavior. Instead, now you can actually customize your kit further so that, if it's this, you get this, and if it's this, you get that. So, you can use if statements that way. Now, one of the other things that you can do with if statements is you can actually, see, well, first we'll talk about what I have on the screen here. Really handy is when you talk about this doing this or this doing that, you can actually also vary that to have different line items operate differently. And so this is, you can see here with this clips example. So right now I have two clips, like I referenced earlier, two clip line items. One is sort of the single clips and the other one is the package style. And maybe for my purposes, what I want is if I'm just doing a small job, I want to just send individual clips, based on whatever might be needed for that particular project. But as soon as I get above the spot where I need, the larger packages, or maybe it's the R250 package, I'm just going to shift and I'm just going to start sending whole packages of 50 to the job site, whatever is needed to accomplish it. So you can see here, I have both of these items listed, but both of these have an if statement with it that basically says, if it's less than 400 square feet, then we're sending little clips, or individual clips. If we're more than 400 square feet, then I'm going to send these. And so you can see the operators on the end of both of these, that if it's not true, that I'm basically doing nothing. So the line item will be blank in one case, and then it will instead, this line item below would be populated. Or if this one is blank, then this one's going to be populated. So you can actually mix and match your if statements even across different line items within your kit, again, with the intent or the goal of getting different behavior depending on what situation you're in. Extend that concept a little bit further, and not only can you do this, what we have shown here on the screen, you can also, with if statements, you can nest those if statements. And what I mean by that, and this is sort of an extreme example, I'm going to pull up a different view here. So here we go. Here's an example of one that we put together at one point for like ceiling strapping. So here you can see that to start with, I've got just an if statement, right? And so here's the thing that we're checking to see if it's true. Here's what would happen if it is true. So I'm going to get this set of values that's going to go into my ceiling strapping, 10 12 footers, 10 14 footers, 10 16 footers. So I'm going to get this. Now, when we come over here to find out what happens if this statement here at the beginning is false, instead of having just a specific thing to do, notice instead now we have another if statement that's been put in its place. So it's kind of an if statement nested inside of an if statement. So if it's false, now it goes and checks this over here, which now we're checking this value. If it's true, we do this. If it's not true, and then again, we've nested again. And this one's pretty extreme, right? We've actually, if I scroll to the right, this actually just keeps going because there was very specific behavior that we were actually trying to accomplish. And so that's going to, depending on how far down the road you go, you're going to get to this specific behavior. And this actually even ends with doing nothing. I think at the end or near the end it does. And so then in this case, you end up sending more 16 footers and this line item becomes into play. So lots of things you can do with if statements. But the big three takeaways would be that you can leverage in your concepts would be, being able to vary your behaviors based on a certain thing happening. If it's this, then do this. If it's this, do that. So there's that concept. But then taking that and leveraging that further by using multiple line items and using the option for a blank operator, where it's basically if it doesn't meet the criteria, then it does nothing, kind of like you're seeing right here is another example of it. And then third, like we talked about, was going across multiple line items. So nesting those if statements across multiple items and getting varied behavior. So that's the SIF function. It's one that I usually recommend because it'll just keep you the safest as far as getting inputs that it expects. Last one, just want to touch on here when it comes to, I'm going to come back over, let's see, is this, would be the concat statement. Now, this one is pretty specific to when you have a need. Let's see, I'm going to come over to my barge. Yeah, we'll go with this one here. So we've got our barge, and with our barge, or like our pitched fascia, you might think of it as, depending on where you're coming from, I want to be able to send those outlookers. And when it comes to the outlooker application, if I actually open this up, I'm going to find that this outlooker application is an SQL type formula. Sorry, yes, the outlooker is. And so it's expecting to receive that kind of input. It's expecting to, when it gets information gets put into it, it's looking for a quantity length list. So it's not enough to just put in a linear footage, like I need 500 linear feet, because the outlooker is expecting that I need 12 footers or 14 footers or something like that, a list of items. So in order to do that, and now allowing it to be flexible, you need to be able to, on the one hand, calculate how many 12 footers you need, but you also need to be able to designate with the formula, like what is the length that you want to send. In this case, it's 12 footers. So without going to the specifics of why we're doing what we're doing, in this case, though, we're taking the linear footage of the parent of the barge, and for every linear foot of barge, we want to send 1 linear foot of outlooker material. So we're going to take the total linear footage and divide it by 12, and that's going to give us how many 12 footers we need. So that's what the first part of this statement is. So you can see the concat statement is made up of basically a couple different things. You can see there's the first part, and then there's a comma, and then the second part. So you can join, basically 2 statements together. So in this case, on this first side of this concat statement, and I'm going to show you this just from the inside. Here's the concat formula is right. Let's see where to go. Right here. You can see here is the string, and a string is what it's expected. So the function you're using is concat, and then you're using a string, and then a string that you're going to ultimately join together. So in my case, what I'm doing for the first string is I am calculating how many 12 footers. So essentially the quantity that I'm doing there. And then for the second string, what I'm doing is I'm saying, all right, I am going to put a slash. Notice this is inside of quotes, just because I'm not trying to divide anything. I'm just basically just trying to, put this text there. So I'm going to put this in quotes. I'm going to put this divide by, and I'm going to put the 12 to indicate that I want 12 footers. So the result of this, so if we go over and take a look at this example in the material list, I think I have one here. Right, so we've got some outlookers right here. So I'm taking basically the same thing as we did before. Here's the total linear footage. In this case, it's like 42. And I'm figuring that out to get to how many 12 footers I need, which is 4. And then that's why then I have the /12 that's right there because of that second part of the concat string that I put in there. So the concat formula is really one of those if you need, going back to what we said at the beginning, that when you're building a kit, what goes in the input field. So if in the input field, you need to be able to put some kind of a quantity length list, like 4 12 footers in this case, then you would go ahead and use the concat function in order to build out that specific set of information. I'm going to put into that chat window as we kind of wind out here. Feel free to put questions in the QA section here as you go, but I'm going to go ahead and put this there. So that one that I just sent there, that's kind of the first part 1 session of the kits that we did a while back. And then I'm also going to put one here, and that second chat I just put in there would be the part 2. So feel free to copy those links, maybe just copy and paste them into a notepad or something like that onto your side so you can reference them later. But grab those. But just quickly, just kind of as we wind down here, just reviewing those 3 areas that are really the key operators that really kind of let you do most everything that you'd ever want to do with as far as calculating the values is going to be the ceiling function to just round things up, the SIF function or an if statement type function, and then the concat function. So use those 3 functions to get to where you need to be. So thank you very much for joining on here today, and we'll look to answer some of those things up here, or answer some of these other questions as you maybe have them here yet. We'll either answer those here, or we'll get back to you as well. So thanks again for joining today, and then just remember there is one more of our sessions next week following the new year. So look forward to having you back for that one. All right, thank you. Talk to you more later.